promised health study supposed to begin? So I bet one of my folks over here could jump in there.
I'll jump in on that one. So ATSDR, as the funding agency, has released the request for proposals that we are going to respond to for a health study. We're currently engaging with nationally renowned researchers to prepare that grant submission. That we don't have a date when it will start. If we are awarded the funding, we don't have a start date yet. However, while we wait to know whether or not we'll be funded, or when that start date would happen, if we're successfully funded for the health study, we will be doing an exposure assessment in Parchment. The plan is to have that begin before the end of the year, where we'll start collecting serum levels and water levels and conducting surveys among participants in the population to try to understand associations between water levels and serum levels here in the community. So we are working towards the health study. We don't have a solid start date yet, but we are working with people to be very competitive for that funding.
All right, thank you very much. And I think then the last piece was, is the state willing to assist individuals in locating companies' labs to do private blood testing?
So I think I'm trying to remember, I think on the MCART website there may be listed what labs do private blood testing. I know that there's only a few. When we looked to try to find if there were labs that did blood testing, there were only a few that did, but I believe that's on the website, but I'm not positive on it. So
I might also just comment that blood testing for PFAS is an involved procedure, and so you should refer to the MCART website for labs that do it correctly.
So just one more thing to add on the first question, I guess, was the state's involvement in the mill properties and redevelopment. The state is more than happy to help people with brownfield redevelopment and assist with that process. And I think that has been slowly occurring out in the area, and we will continue to help during any future redevelopment out there. As far as remediation going on out there, that is something that we'll definitely be working with any potential liable parties on as well, and potentially just the state itself.
And that's a good segue into this next question, which says, does the Deagle Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, formerly Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, or any other agency have the ability to hold River Reach Partners LLC accountable for their property and the pollution they failed to clean up?
So I believe River Reach purchased the property and completed a baseline environmental assessment. So they have some liability protection there. There is potentially due care obligations that they would have that we potentially could hold them responsible for, but at this point in time, I don't know if we know of any due care violations that they have.
Okay. And again, we'll have folks here afterwards for any one-on-one questions if you don't feel like your question's been addressed appropriately at this juncture. Next question is the Parchment and Richland area the only sites in Kalamazoo County being investigated, I presume, for PFAS? I'll say I know Ross Township is another area, but if you want to expand, maybe please.
Yeah, so the short answer is no. There are other investigations ongoing, either private or directed through the state. Up in Otsego, which part of that investigation is actually in Kalamazoo County. That is one that's going on. And then there's a number of other locations, facilities where private parties have been directed to start sampling for PFAS.
Okay, thank you. So these are questions about well depth. What's the depth of a shallow or deep well that show contamination in the tests, and what changes in any monitoring wells show in the weekly emails.
So the depths of the monitoring wells, shallow wells typically will range anywhere from 20 to 35 feet. The deeper wells in the Parchment area are down over 100. And it's about the same in the Richland area as well, with our shallow, intermediate, and deeps. And those all, of course, have little variations as to where the screens are set, based on the geology that's encountered during the investigation, during the installation of the well, and also the topography. If it's located in a higher elevation, it could change the depth of the well. Changes to the maps that are on the weekly updates. Typically what has been happening is more data has been added to those maps. So data hasn't really changed in a well location. If it has a color, that's pretty much been the color that has been the whole time. Just new data has been added to the maps.
Thank you. This is a question about when will deer or animals be tested for PFAS, PFOA in Parchment area, and would deer meat processed locally be affected by contaminated water if it's used in the processing? Would chemicals be absorbed by tissue of deer?
Okay, so last year there was deer collected from 4 sites across the state. It was in Oscoda, where there's really high levels in Clark's Marsh, near Alpena, where there's high levels in Camp Grayling, and then in North Kent County. And from all of that sampling, the only deer meat that was of concern was 1 deer in Oscoda out of 20. And there were 20 taken from each of those 4 areas. And as I said, we have Clark's Marsh there that has extremely high levels, I think some of the highest surface water levels in the country. So those were taken. We have not seen, as I said, it was only 1 deer that was right by Clark's Marsh. There were 19 other deer that didn't have levels of concern in the deer meat. So we don't think it's a widespread problem with deer, but we are looking at one other location where there's high levels in surface water, and we should get data later this year and see if that's a concern. And that'll help inform us whether other areas may also need to be considered.
Okay, great. Again, if we don't fully cover your question, we'll be here. This person lives on Springbrook Avenue, a quarter mile from Russell Farm, PFAS level of 2,000. Has not heard anything about screening and what their levels of PFAS are. It's a pretty geographically specific question, I think.
Yeah, so I guess without knowing exactly where you're at, I do know that some of those homes up along Springbrook were sampled, but I don't think all of them up there have been, and that's due to the fact that we had a certain study area in place, and our res well sampling only went a certain distance out, and a buffer zone as well. So that may be why you haven't been sampled. If, from what we're seeing with investigation of installation of monitoring wells and the data that comes back, if that changes anything, then yes, we may look to expand that study area even farther out. But at this time, yeah, if you haven't been sampled, unless you were missed the first time around, which I believe the majority of homes we actually were able to sample. So unless you were missed the first time around, you would not be in the sampling at this time.
And I point out that John mentioned that if you did give your information on your card, we can follow up with you that way as well. So we'll be happy to be in touch. This is a question about explaining the difference between multiple levels of concentration of PFAS for action. At one point it sounded like 70 parts per trillion is required for action. At another point it seemed that 9 parts per trillion is the level that will lead to action.
Okay, so I'm gonna talk a little bit about regulatory numbers and public health screening levels. So regulatory numbers have to go through a process for regulation, and those are handled by, through DEQ or the US EPA, I'm sorry, Eagle. First week, bear with me. So those go through a process where they have to go through a regulatory process like Steve showed for the MCLs. Remember the timeline he showed, that it's got to go through this process? So with our agency, we don't have that kind of process. We do have public health screening levels that we use normally on a site-by-site basis. In this case, because we were dealing with PFAS in people's drinking water wells across the state, we thought it was good for us to develop screening levels and use them for all of the sites across the state. We normally look to see what, if we don't have our own screening levels, we look to see what our federal partners and other state agencies have. In this case, we looked at what our federal partners and other state agencies had, and we found that concentrate levels, as you know, 70 part per trillion was developed by EPA a couple years ago. And if you look at the trends from all of the other numbers that have been coming out from other states, the numbers have been coming down. And I think it's because we have more information. So we used, as I said, our federal partner, the Agency for Toxic Substance and Disease Registry, their toxicity value. And then another state, Minnesota, had that approach to protect for that fetus and breastfed infant. And we thought that approach, because they were the more exposed, was appropriate. So we combined that toxicity value with that model for protecting the fetus and breastfed infant to make sure that we were protecting the most vulnerable population. So that's how we came up with our screening levels. And so we use screening levels differently than the state agency does. They have, it gives them regulatory authority, and we do not provide, we are not regulatory. We provide recommendations for how people can protect themselves and try to help people. In this case, we have funding to help mitigate your exposure, that we work with the health departments to provide filters and alternate water.
Thanks, Deb. And I just wanted to add is that, so this conversation here really illustrates the need to better understand what the level should be and what the action level should be for public water supplies. And that's why, you know, the governor asked MPART to assemble some outside scientists to advise us, given all of what all the other states are doing. She said, you know, specifically, look at all of the proposed and current standards across the country that, you know, that Deb talked about, and how those standards were developed, and then advise the rulemaking process what the numbers should be from a health-based perspective before we start looking for enforceable standards under the drinking water program that will look at additional things like, you know, what is the feasibility of actually achieving those standards? How, you know, how dependably can you analyze for them? Which compounds should you look at? Should it be more than just PFOA and PFOS? Should it be additional ones like, you know, Deb mentioned up here through the Human Health Work Group, and MPART came up with, you know, standards for 5. So, again, I think it's a really good conversation to have. We're looking forward to get that advice from these scientists to say, okay, what should we start pursuing then for drinking water supplies and enforceable levels going forward? Now, those concentrations under the Safe Drinking Water Act won't apply directly to your private residential well. So everything that Deb talked about in what these public health recommendations using screening levels and all of her other tools will continue. That hasn't changed. DHHS will continue to provide those public health recommendations going forward for everybody with their private residential well.
So I wanted to put this slide up because I thought we might get this kind of question. And Steve's right. there's gonna be difference of opinion. So as you can see, there's different numbers that range in concentrations from different states, different agencies. And it's all the different assumptions, what people think are the right toxicity values, how much someone drinks, whether they're looking at an adult or a child or an infant in setting that number. So it changes also whether they expect all of your exposure to PFAS to come from your drinking water or that you could get it from other sources. So those are all things that go into decisions on what these numbers could be. And those are the kind of decisions that different people make different decisions. And so you get different numbers.
I think just one more thing to point out in regards to that is with the addition of the screening values that DHHS has come up with, it really has not changed the risk, the individual risk of any of the wells in the parchment or the Richland areas due to the fact that we had study area and buffer zone and we preemptively gave people the option to have the filter and gave filters out. So really, people that are in that area are protected even with those numbers, the screening values coming out.
Great, thank you. And it says, I'm not quite sure if we'll get this right, but knowing that the public wells were not just old, but close to several polluting factories, why were new wells not created years ago? Was the water ever tested before 2018?
I think that's likely getting more to the question of the municipal supply, those 3 production wells. And so the testing that was done for PFOS, PFOA, and the other PFAS compounds, that was done, by the state, as I mentioned earlier, last year to get a better understanding of what the occurrence of PFAS compounds are in our drinking water supply. Wasn't necessarily looking to find any contaminated source or any contamination sources. Those are not currently regulatory requirements for water supplies. And in fact, some of the testing methods, there's very few labs across the country that can even test for those compounds. So unless somebody tested their water as part of an EPA required testing program a few years ago, and that was only limited supplies to better understand, whether PFAS were in these public water supplies. It would not have been done until the state went in last year and did this. And Michigan, by the way, is I think the only state that has gone through and tested all of our community water supplies. And again, that's over 1,700 supplies, which gave us a really good understanding of what the occurrence of PFAS are. And so again, that was one necessary step going forward to now say we need to establish some enforceable standards so that we routinely begin monitoring for those and addressing them.
Very good, thank you. How do you plan to monitor for potential health issues for the near and distant future?
Currently, our approach, especially if we've heard in North Kent County, is an exposure assessment. And as I mentioned, we'll be implementing an exposure assessment here in Parchment as well, where we're measuring water and blood and trying to understand the relationship between concentrations in water and concentrations in blood. The health study is our first foray into evaluating the health effects, the potential health effects of exposure to PFAS. So going on into the future, we do anticipate collecting information on health outcomes that have been shown to be associated with PFAS in some studies. We'll be working through that process under the auspices of the grant that we hope to get. But even in the absence of that, we will be working towards collecting information on health outcomes in the future. But those plans have yet to be determined as we develop our methodology for this particular grant that's going in.
Great. What percentage of PFAS contamination has been seen from corporations versus government or military versus landfill leaks or private citizen waste? And acknowledging that these are harder to determine.
So, good question. We haven't actually crunched the numbers. The slide I showed you up there of those 49 known sites includes, landfills that were known to have leaked before. It includes the site that, Nate mentioned earlier, North 34th Street in Richland Township, that we thought we had cleaned up, a former chrome plater that had existing contamination. It includes military installations, active and closed former bases, where they use the firefighting foams, to save lives and property. So, there's no one quantified answer for that, because we are also looking at over 100 more sites as we systematically try to identify other sources of contamination and make sure we're protecting drinking water supply. So we're not done. We've got a lot more investigation work to do. And so again, it's a matter of prioritizing that. So I would not want to highlight any one particular source or cause of the PFAS contamination.
So there's a few questions here that kind of on a similar theme. It's a question about, in similarity to deer or wild animals, how about is it safe to consume produce or crops grown in soil, whether it's soil that was prior to the hookup in parchment, and now also, do we know for sure that parchment water is safe to drink? And is it okay to water with the city water now coming from Kalamazoo's municipal system?
So I'm going to try to answer that question. So the first part of the question about whether it was a concern for past use of parchment water when the contamination was there, we really don't know the answer to that. Our advice at the time was because we didn't know the answer, was to maybe not consume your garden vegetables if you were concerned about it. We've looked in the published literature. We actually were talking about, we've been doing literature searches, that there's not a lot of information. It varies significantly on what type of crop it is, whether it's tomatoes or zucchini or corn, and how often you water. So, there's a lot of variability there, so there's not a single answer, and there's not a lot of good data to know the answer to that. So we're looking. Most of the data we've seen was for levels that were lower than what you guys had, and they didn't see any concerns. The one study that was the best study we could find was much lower concentrations, so we really didn't have an answer to that, but we are looking through the literature and seeing what we can find. Now, my understanding is that parchment water has been tested and it's fine for PFAS. There's no PFAS in the water, to my understanding. But I'm going to let Steve handle that question.
Well, and I don't look at the data on a daily basis, but the good news was, I think by August, that they had addressed the higher concentrations of PFAS in the parchment water system by connecting to the Kalamazoo supply. And they continue to monitor for PFAS to ensure that the levels are well within acceptable means. Heather, do you have anything else you want to add? See if I can stretch this over here.
We'll stretch, maybe.
My name is Heather Bishop. I'm the Community Water Supply Supervisor for the Kalamazoo District Office. So I am also an EGLE staff person, and we cover all the community water supplies in Southwest Michigan. So I am actually that person that looks at that data when it comes in. And just so you know, the data is actually published publicly on the MPART website. So if you ever wanted to look at the parchment data, it is updated there monthly. 6 sites in the parchment distribution system are sampled every month. And the levels of PFOA and PFOS run around 5 parts per trillion. So you can have pretty good confidence that the water being delivered by Kalamazoo is either low or no detections of PFAS. And the data is available on the web.
Well, you got that, I'm not sure if you want to, but it's asking also about how to test one's water for lead.
If you live in the city of Parchment, or if you live elsewhere but are a customer of the city of Kalamazoo, the city offers free lead testing to anybody that's a water customer. So you can actually call the city of Kalamazoo and they can set you up with that sampling. Kalamazoo is actually doing compliance monitoring for DEQ right now, so they may not be able to, come right out and test right away, but they do have a process for customers of the city of Kalamazoo water system to be able to get their lead tested.
And then, I'm not sure about this, but should people be buying reverse osmosis water treatment units?
I can't speak to whether, I guess, reverse osmosis under the Safe Drinking Water Act, to the best of my knowledge, is not an approved treatment technology. But whether you want to purchase that for your own private well, I can't speak to that.
I know that question has come up before and it's difficult to answer, so no problem. What is the status of the South 40th Street site? I know that's a real specific piece there, so that may be something that I may not be able to field here. But Nate's gonna try, or not, no. South 40th Street site.
We'll have a mic back over.
I guess cordless.
We have a team.
Hi, my name is Dave Haywood. I'm the district supervisor for the Remediation and Redevelopment Division, and I'm a main supervisor. And so, question about the North 40th Street.
40th Street.
Are we talking about 40th Street in Charleston Township?
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. It's just recently come to my attention that apparently Georgia Pacific did have a landfill there that they put some waste in, and so we are going to take a look at that and determine whether or not we should be going out there and sampling residential wells. Okay. Also, if I could, I want to go back to the question about Springbrook, and I'm sorry I have to correct you on this one, but we have not sampled any of the residential wells on Springbrook today, and the reason being is because we sampled a whole bunch of wells, going out kind of radially in Cooper Township from where the former Parchment Supply wells were, and we did all that work back in August primarily. I think a little bit may have gone into September, and as the further we went out, we've increasingly found more wells that were going down in concentration, and so at that point and again, that was all done with the safety net of the study area, the buffer zones where people were either receiving filters or bottled water, and still are at this point, to make sure that there was no inappropriate exposure. And at that point, we made the decision that we needed to start the investigation, and as Nate reported to you earlier, we were just getting ready to start that investigation when Georgia Pacific stepped in, and so they have done that investigation. And I actually, on my phone, just checked the map that is on the Kalamazoo County website, and Georgia Pacific installed 2 monitoring wells right there on Riverview, and I believe Van Buren. 2 of them were non-detect, and one was, and if you go and you look at the maps on the website, you'll see that the one closest to Springbrook actually has a yellow dot, which means it's below 10, and you'll see a table on the website that will tell you that the concentration found there was 2.83 parts per trillion. So at this point in time, we don't have any reason to believe that the wells on Springbrook are at risk. Okay.
Thank you for being available to field that. And this comes back to a brief mention that was made previously. There's been some testing done in the Otsego area. And does the panel have any information regarding water quality and PFAS contamination that comes south into Alamo Township, which is Kalamazoo County?
Give it back to Dave.
So, what's happening in Otsego? Well, last year, actually it started just about a year ago, in response to a number of residents in the Otsego area having concerns about what they believed were higher than normal rate of adverse health outcomes in the community. We, and along with the state health department, the Allegheny County Health Department, and Kalamazoo County Health Department has been participating as well. And also a representative from the Agency for Toxic Substance and Disease Registry, which again is part of the Centers for Disease Control. We all work together to listen to the people's concerns, and then we decided at that point, okay, we're gonna start an investigation. The first thing we did was we looked at what we knew about contamination in the area, sites that we were already aware of, many of which we had actually worked on using state dollars to mitigate risk at already. And so, and through the course of our investigation, as what the records show, we did see that there was potential concerns with past activities by the former Menasha Paper Company that operated in Otsego for many, many years until they shut down in 2005 and subsequently sold their business to National Gypsum. And so what we decided to do is we went out and we sampled a number of residential wells kind of across the area. We tried to get a broad cross section near. There were a number of farm fields that historically received paper sludge from the former Menasha plant, because when they were doing that back in the day, it's kind of the same concept as the biosolids from wastewater treatment plants. The paper sludge from the biosolids from the wastewater treatment plants, by municipalities. Okay, well, the paper sludge coming from paper plants, because it was a pulp mill, they're breaking down trees in order to, produce their pulp feedstock for making paper. Well, obviously trees are high in nitrogen because they're a plant, and so the paper sludge had a pretty high nitrogen content, and so it was considered a great crop amendment. And so back then, of course, nobody was thinking about PFAS, and so it was never sampled for PFAS back in the 80s when this activity was taking place. And so we selected drinking water wells around some of the fields where this material was placed, and we also selected drinking water wells around the former Menasha paper plant, and they also had an on-site landfill where they put a lot of their waste material. And we sampled for 200 chemicals, and for the most part, we didn't find much other than out of a total of 66 wells that we sampled initially, there were 11 wells that had some level of PFAS in them, but none of them were above 70. They were all either in that middle bucket or in what we call the lower bucket, the 0 to 10 range. Okay, and a couple of those were in Alamo Township. Okay, and so what we're doing now is we've been out for the last few weeks doing some sampling of soil in the farm fields that we have records that did receive paper sludge from the former Menasha mill. And so we'll be waiting to see what those results bring us, and if we have any significant detections that we find, that will be the basis for continuing our investigation to determine if those detections represent any kind of threat to public health or not. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. If it doesn't, we'll have them find you. Can you explain the concept of a plume, and do we know if and how the contamination is spread?
So when we talk about a plume, we're typically talking in groundwater. So once the contamination has made it down to the groundwater, there are certain flow components to the groundwater as it moves through the aquifer, through the sand, the silt, the clay. It has different velocities, different vertical components to it. And typically when you see most contamination plumes, they're long cigar shape. So you'll have your source and then kind of a long cigar shape going out from that. Depending on water and flow direction and where we're at, you can have different flow directions. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing in Richland. We have definitely kind of two different areas where the plume appears to be going out in Richland. In Parchment, we also have the influence of the river being right there as well, which kind of flattens out the groundwater flow and sometimes even kind of stagnates it, which may end up pushing it a little bit or sloshing it around. So there's a lot of different variables when you're talking about how the plume moves and reacts, but that's basically what we're talking about when we talk about a plume, is in the groundwater and where that contamination is going. And out in Parchment, at least, the plume, for the most part, it appears to be going to the Kalamazoo River. We know that the Kalamazoo River definitely acts as a big gaining stream. Out in Richland, like I said, we have contamination that's going to the east-northeast towards Gull Lake, and then we also have contamination that's going to the southeast as well.
I live in a buffer area. My private well was not tested. Will you be testing again and hitting those untested wells?
Right now in the buffer zones, no, we do not have any plans right now to test those wells. If something were to change with monitoring well data, then yes, potentially we would look to expand out testing if we need to expand the study area out.
Anyone else with question cards? I don't have any more on the particular topic. I do have a question about shutting down line 5, which is the pipelines running across the Straits of Mackinac, and I do still stand by my position to shut down line 5. And this represents a huge potential threat to our Great Lakes ecosystems, and there's been enough close calls that lead me to think that this is a ticking time bomb. There's been an anchor strike that was recorded, did not rupture the pipelines, but this is a situation that I think needs to come to an end very quickly, lest we have